My name is Terrance Barkan, and I'm the Executive Director of the Graphene Council. And today we're interviewing Alex Correa from Gerdau Graphene. And what is your position, Alex?
Okay, so today I have two roles at Gerdau, one at Gerdau, one at Gerdau Graphene. So basically, we've started 2 years ago. We started a new division at Gerdau looking at new investments outside or adjacent to steel. And then amongst these investments, we have a chapter at advanced materials. And then at Gerdau, I'm looking at these opportunities of looking at different advanced materials that we could spin off as new companies or new ventures to support Gerdau's growth. And the first actual investment we did in that sense was opening a company called Gerdau Graphene last April. And then I'm the CEO of this new company. So I'd say today, 90% of my time is leading Gerdau Graphene. We really are focusing on getting it started correctly and ramping up quickly. But I also do have some other activities within Gerdau, looking at some other projects.
And Gerdau Graphene is not actually a graphene producer. So what is your business model? What is Gerdau Graphene's business model?
Yeah, that's a great question. And usually when people ask me about Gerdau Graphene, I usually say that we try to break two myths, really, so that there is no A graphene. There's a lot of graphitic materials that we work with. I mean, our industry works with, and so do we, right? And that we're not a graphene producer, like you mentioned, right? So today, our business model really is to produce additives, so chemical additives, mineral additives, and master batches that have graphene inside them as a value add. So it's all about really understanding the right type of graphitic material, the right type of graphene that we can use to get the best performance from an additive, right, or in an end product. And then finding the right way to produce these additives with these materials, this graphene inside of it, to get the best performance for our end customer. So that's basically our business model. So let's say we're right in between the chain, between what the graphene producers are doing today and their end customers who are going to use this product to make sure we get an additive that is plug and play, that can easily go into the industrial chains to provide them the value that they're looking for.
Excellent. Well, as you say, that puts you in the middle between graphene producers and actual end users of the material. So with that business model, what is the biggest challenge that you guys have seen on the supply side, on the procurement of graphene materials?
Okay. So I think that there are a few, actually, right? So the first one is having that we've seen so far is having material in the right cost and the right volume, right? So basically, I think there's several producers, a handful that actually have this a more, let's say, industrial scale. But even if you look at the producers having the biggest volumes, right, it's a funny equation, because for what we have of demand today, you have a lot of surplus volume within the market, right? If you look into what we see the potential of the use of this material, once you have one or two projects available, then you start having a big issue that we have to deal with moving forward, of the lack of volume. That's one, I think, point, right? And I think even because of that restrained volume, and because of also the way these companies are set up, today we still see prices of graphene, not for everybody, but for several suppliers that make interesting projects not viable, economically speaking, right? So I think we are investing in these projects anyway, believing that they'll become viable with the growth. But it is also a blocker when you talk about a traditional company trying to look at this ingredient as something that they could use in their supply chain. So I think that's one of the biggest challenge today, right? Moving forward, one of the things we are trying to map out and understand whether it will be a challenge or not is how stable, what the variability of these products, right? So I think since no one is using graphene in industrial scale, one concern we have is once we have a TDS, right, from one of these materials, and we have the material specifications, how variable, how they'll vary for every lot of production or batch of production once we move forward, right? So we're currently buying volumes of graphene to try to understand the current variability of the existing supply chain of the producers. But we're sure there's something we have to work on as we move forward with the actual application and sale of products with graphene.
So if we look at the value chain of graphene, there's the graphene production, which you're sourcing from, and then you have this application development space in the middle, right, where you're actually putting graphene as an additive into a product, as you said, to improve its performance. If I understand correctly, Gerdau Graphene is really focused on coatings, paints, concrete, and on different plastics applications, which could include composites, both thermoset and thermoplastic.
Yes.
Why have you guys chosen those particular markets to focus on?
Okay, these are the markets we believe are the first movers, right? So when before we actually opened the company, we did a very large market scan looking at all the say the 55 potential applications that we have from the Graphene Council from you guys, right? And looking basically at say two I think points, two angles from it, right? One is uh, how ready was the technology for these markets? So was the R&D work or the actual research universities of the application of the graphene in these markets ready, or in a say a more mature stage that required some small time to get it up to the market. And then also we looked at the same sense. Okay, what is the for each one of these markets? How quickly do they turn new products commercially, right? So if you talk about doing an application, for example, in aerospace, it has a very long development period and validation period, whereas if you do something in a more CPG environment, that can be much quicker. So we tried to pick initially markets which had the application technology of graphene more mature in a way, or which would have a little less of energy to get it to the mature point, of markets that could move quicker in terms of converting a new additive or a new product into something that is actually commercial. That's one angle we looked at it, right? The other one was also, okay, what is the actual business potential of that market, right? So in the end, we see a lot that innovation, right, is a good idea times it's invoiced, right? It goes away from becoming just a good idea if you actually get it invoiced and out into the market. So it's also important because all this requires a lot of investment to see what is the total size of this market. Does it have a healthy business in terms of the economics, right? So we also try to look at that, and then these markets were the 5 markets that had the right intersection of these two angles, so to speak, right?
Excellent. And on the demand side, so the application side, as you said, you want to be able to actually commercialize these applications. So that means you have to have customers and customers at volume. Mm-hmm. What is the biggest obstacle today for greater adoption, either scale or speed or both?
I think that the greatest one is looking at how do you get a product to a client that he can readily use, right? I think the main challenge is the market is looking at this more as a commodity. They try to sell you the black powder, so to speak, or the graphene in its purest form. And actually what the market wants is a value proposition or an ingredient, right, for his supply chain, right? So I think one of the biggest challenges is, of course, the R&D, right? So it's finding the right material, functionalizing it, getting it formulated into an additive, right? So I don't make it sound that this is not relevant or challenging. It is very challenging, right? But I think there's a lot of companies, a lot of universities, a lot of people already working on that sense, both from supply side, the client side, and research centers, right? So I think it is a challenge, but there's work being done there in the right path. I think the real challenge today really is how do we, from this research, end up having a product that can be easily applied to an existing supply chain. I think many companies will work on the solution, but they're still trying to supply in the end the graphene, right? And no industrial supply chain today you can use the graphene in its purest form. You have to use, or even a dispersion. I think you have to use some kind of ingredient or additive that can be quickly incorporated in an existing supply chain. So that's really where we're trying to fit our model, which is going a step further in transforming this technology or the dispersion of graphene into a commercially viable additive, or maybe substituting an existing additive for a new one with graphene inside, to then make it easier to that to be applied to supply chain. So I think that's really the biggest challenge, right? From what we hear from clients and from the market. The second one is a few clients have actually done that or found partners that can do that for them, but then they go back and say, look, we are not very confident that the industry will go supply us this material in scale and in cost that we need. So we're ready to use it in a way, but then when you start looking at the sheer size we can have of this consumption in the years to come and the price points, we are not confident that this will be supplied to us, right? So it's how do we have a partner that has the the scale and the economics to really invest in supply chain capability to supply this to us not only today, but as we grow our industries, right? So I think there's these two biggest challenges.
I would share that perspective. And I think what you hit on is something quite interesting. There's two key words that you mentioned. One is functionalization, which for people who maybe are not familiar with what we mean with functionalization of graphene, it's a way of enhancing the materials, chemically altering them or improving upon them, either for dispersion or for some other mechanical property. And the other one is the dispersion, the ability to disperse it in a hosting medium. Now, there are a few companies that specialize in those technologies and techniques. And I also know that, Gerdau, you have invested over the years in your own capacity in working through the GEEK, for example, at the University of Manchester and developing it. What is your strategy going forward about having these kind of skills? What do you keep in-house versus what do you continue to outsource, which gives you more flexibility?
Okay. So I think for sure, the technology of the functionalization, the dispersion, the formulating, right, into a product, these we should keep in-house, or we should work very closely to strategic partners, right? That's really the key of the business, right? So that's something I think we definitely will keep investing in. And of course, as mentioned, there are several companies out there who are doing this quite well, and we're more than happy also in investing together and making strategic partnerships also to work together. But that's something we have to really incorporate as part of our knowledge and value to the market, right? On the other hand, when we talk about the production of graphene itself, right, the different types of productions and how to scale it, so on, that's something that we are happy also to keep at the market and support the growth of existing companies through investments, through contracts, through the actual volume we can purchase. But that's something we feel that the companies who can do that quite well, and they'll be specialized in that, and we're taking it from that point, finding the right material, and then transforming it into the end product we want to sell to the market.
So can you speak a little bit about what you had mentioned at the beginning? There are many different forms and types of graphene. So if you think about it that way, and you're looking at all these different applications in large volumes, talk about, do you see yourselves working primarily with one or two suppliers, or actually having to work with, a number of suppliers, both for volume and variety of material?
So our main strategy since the beginning has been to work with a large, not a large group, but a bigger group of suppliers that can give us different types of materials at different price points, at different volumes, right? I think when you look at, again, there is no a graphene. You have different types of materials, right? From let's say the basic groupings of nanoplatelets and then a few layer graphene and graphene oxide, reduced graphene oxide. So these, you have different families of products, but within each family, for example, you can have different qualities of product, right? Not only quality per se in terms of purity or the quality of the material, but also you can have, depending on how you produce, you can have larger area of materials, right? Higher, more or less layers, right? Different functionalization groups, so that can change a lot, right? And depending on what application we're putting graphene on, a different material could have a gain in performance versus another type of material, or it can have or the gain, the trade-off between the gain and the cost can be interesting, right? So there are only a few companies that have a larger, say, portfolio of different types of materials, but still these are restricted, right? So again, our strategy is to find the right supplier for the right solution, and then partner with him in that production line or that value stream. And then for another application, we can have a different supplier, right? So for example, we could have the ideal partner for an additive for paints, whereas it'll be a different partner for the ideal solution for concrete, for example, or for plastics, right? So, and again, we see there's a huge potential in the market for each one of these segments, right? So I think everybody can grow and gain in that, and have their space within these different partnerships in a way.
Yeah, we would certainly support that view. Just to put this in perspective, maybe for those who are listening or watching this, that the Graphene Council forecasts over the next 3 to 6 years somewhere between 300 and 600,000 metric tons per annum demand just for a handful of markets like cement, coatings, plastics, et cetera. And the current production volume is around 10,000 metric tons. So there's a huge spread. So I don't think we're going to see graphene producers competing with each other for volume in the next, decade, really. It's going to be more about scaling to meet that kind of demand. Now, we've talked about different markets as potential demand drivers. What about different geographies? Graphene is produced pretty much all over the world in different areas. Gerdau Graphene, born out of Brazil.
Yes.
Where do you see geographically the most promising markets?
I think it's tied into how mature each country is, and also how well developed each economy is, right? So I think when you talk about our end markets, as you mentioned earlier, right, we're talking about graphene in like paint specifically, but saying, and then construction materials such as concrete and mortars, right, and composites. So when you talk about basically these markets, right, they have a different maturity, a different scale in each region. We are specifically looking initially the Americas region. So for sure, the U.S. market is the largest one by far, right? Well, we see also very interesting markets, for example, in Mexico, in Canada, in Brazil, for some of these applications, right? So let's say these will be for us, let's say the four main countries to start looking at. So that's where our strategy is focused for the beginning. But of course, if you move down to Europe or even to Asia, there are very interesting markets for these applications too, right? So I think we have to look at the end market, right, and then how developed that is, what pain points these end markets have, we can address with graphene. So that also will help us see which market is larger or smaller. So anyway, but again, I think there's potential in most any market. I think, as you mentioned, there's a huge potential across the board, really, with this technology, right?
Well, given that there are so many applications and so many markets, I think one of the challenges has been for graphene companies to focus, right? They go after a lot of small opportunities, and then that can make it difficult for them to gain traction. What is your thought about that, of focusing on vertical markets or geographic markets? And then to that end, do you need to be in the market? Do you need to be in North America to serve that market? Do you need to be in Europe to serve that market? What is your thought on that?
Okay, I think, well, the easiest way, the most straightforward way is basically to focus on one application, one market, and then move in the geography. Right? I think that's probably the easiest way, due to the sheer amount of R&D investment you have to do to have a solution. Right? If you say I only want to focus on one country and look at 10 different applications, it's 10 times the R&D investment, rather than having, if it's the same application across different geographies, you have to adjust and buy the market, but it's a smaller investment. I think that's the most straightforward way, thinking that we have to quickly open the market, something that's completely new, right? But then I think, back to your point, I think definitely having intimacy with the end market and geography is very important, right? So for sure, your customer base, the product recipe in a way, and what you have, availability of other additives that can compete with a graphene additive, will change market by market, right? So I think you have to have a good maybe starting round in one country, and then start, like any other business, really spreading to different geographies, having intimacy with that market to then adjust your offering for that market, right? So I think that's really the best way. And then you have also a whole discussion about regulatory and normative themes you have to also attack with graphene. It's a new material. They also will change by each country, right? So that also being present also will help you to work around that topic, right?
I have to ask you, because the Graphene Council has been working on standards for some while, and then recently released the Graphene Classification Framework, which I know a lot of graphene companies are adopting and using. Can you just speak a little bit how useful or otherwise the Graphene Classification Framework is, and these kind of standardization efforts are for the market? How important is that really?
I think this is key, really. This is key, right? So for any kind of industrial application and growth, this has to be done, right? So I think we're very happy with the work that was done by Graphene Council. It's a very good framework. I think we're adopting it ourselves. I think it helps us a lot understanding the material we're using, explaining also the differences of the different sources to the end customers, right? And internally to our teams, but also externally to the customers. But I think one of the key elements we're missing in this industry is really all the discussion on standards, right? It's very hard to talk about how do you bring something to scale in terms of health and safety, in terms of of quality standards in terms of right costing. If you don't have a standard to work around it, right? I think that's the building block that will give you really all the discussions around the topic, even the discussions back to taxing and so on, taxes and so on. If you talk about a country like, for example, Brazil, so that's critical. And I think it's something that has to happen quickly. I think for this industry to mature and pick up, right? So I think there's a lot of homework we still have to do in that sense as an industry. I think the framework that was put out is fantastic. It's a very good starting point, and it has to be now used and then upgraded, right, as we move along. That's for sure. Even again to differentiate the different types of graphene materials, like I mentioned earlier, and their uses, right? I think that is key, and I think the framework does that quite well also, right? Having the right tools or the right information from different types of graphenes, right? Differentiating them and their initial specs, right?
And if we look at the investment community who has looked at graphene now for a while, sometimes they can be quite impatient. We've had people clamoring for over a decade for a quote unquote killer application for graphene. Personally, I think, those expectations are misplaced. I think the exciting thing about graphene is in some of the most mundane materials, like what it can do for cement and concrete, right, and tremendously improve it. So I just want to kind of get your perspective on how would you characterize the pace of development, the pace of adoption, the need for the investment community or stakeholders to have the right timeline perspective and patience. What should the expectation be for a new material to be fully commercialized? What does that horizon look like from your perspective?
Okay, so I think a few thoughts on that. So I think was one point you mentioned is quite interesting. Sometimes people will confuse or will misplace the end market, let's say expected margin versus the application of graphene expected margin. What do I mean by that? For example, sometimes people will think it's electronics as a killer application because it's a high value, high margin market, right? And they say, oh, this must be better as a first sight than applying this in cement, right? But then if you look at the benefits you can have, for example, in graphene in concrete, right? So the value add you can have of the pricing you can add to concrete with graphene, and the saving you can have raw material, that spread in margin is many times higher than the same graphene application electronics, right? The extra price you can have and the savings in costing is not that high, right? So even though it is a much more interesting market in terms of margins, the benefit brought by graphene, and if you're a graphene producer or graphene producer, you have to look at really the value you're bringing, not together with the value of the market, right? Only the value of the market. Right? So sometimes I think you have to look at this from this perspective. So that's one thing that sometimes people misplace, and they're looking at more high-end applications where it won't pick up so quickly because there's not such a high value of graphene there that is in other applications. Right? That's one thing that I usually like to remember people, right? But I think back to your question, I think we are at a moment, let's say, an inflection point where I think the overall market is picking up speed for the graphene application, but it's beginning to pick up speed. So I think there's still several years ahead to have a mass use technology, right? I think we already I see already say killer applications available in terms of technology in the market. If you look at what's been done and what the R&D behind it, they have several applications which could be used today and are very interesting in terms of the value they provide. The challenge again is that's not happening yet because of one, you don't have the standards. Two, you don't have something that's easy to be applied to an existing supply chain, right? You still require your end customers to change their factories for your raw material, which won't happen, right? It won't all happen so quickly, right? And then when you actually want to do that, you have, as I said, clients saying, okay, will the ingredient be there available for us? Will we have graphene in the volumes we need at the prices we need, right? So I think these are some roadblocks that have to be removed, and once they're removed, things will really pick up. So that's why I really believe that it is still some years to get this technology really available in a mass way to the market. But once it starts picking speed, there'll be a very high increase of adoption. Right? You take these roadblocks, people really pick up speed, right? So I think, but again, I think these projects usually take 3 to 5 years, let's say, to complete, right? And then you have another couple of, I want to say 2-3 years to get the whole industry to adopt the new technology, right? So So again, we're talking about let's say another 3, 5, 10 years to really see a good momentum in graphene. And it for sure will be different in different industries, right? You'll see it maybe going quicker in one industry and then picking up pace a little bit slower in another one. Again, it depends on the industry itself, how quickly you put a new product on the shelf or on the market, or also the technology available, right? The value behind it and so on. But there needs to be patience. But I think at least the market is really gaining speed. I think if we were to go 3, 5 years back in time, I think things were still kind of starting. There's a lot of, let's say, question marks whether this will really pick up. I think today it's clear that the value there is just how do we get it in an industrial scale, really. And once these roadblocks are out of the way, it really pick up.
Well, if we look at the constraints on supply, we are talking about a material that's made out of pure carbon, whether it's made out of graphite or from biomass, or if it's made by converting a petroleum product. There really aren't that many significant constraints on the raw material input. There are more than a dozen ways of making graphene now that we've recorded. So there's not a bottleneck on production methodology. So I don't see a constraint on the supply side, right?
Yes.
And on the demand side, it sounds like it's more education. We know that this product works. We know that graphene has significant advancement in dozens of markets. So it's more about education and adoption. Kind of coming full circle, you know, when Gerdau Steel said, look, we have this extremely successful company in Brazil, and we want to develop a whole new industrial area for the company going forward for the next generation. Why is graphene the right material and not some other material?
Okay. Well, first of all, as I mentioned, we're looking at other materials, but I think graphene was the first one we actually are putting investment behind, right? But why graphene? I think, first of all, because of, back to your comment, we've been working with graphene for 4 years now, so it's not a lot of time, but it's enough time to really understand it, the material, understand its value. So we really understand the potential behind it. We see there's a huge potential. And again, it's something that is readily available, right? So it's only a matter of having a mindset of innovation technology in industrial application, right? And that has a very good fit with Gerdau. I think if you go back to the company's origin, right, we began selling nails in the local market in Brazil, and now we have over almost 30 factories in the region, really going all the way from picking the iron ore or actually the scrap metal, which is from most of the materials we have, transforming that into steel with a lot of application of technology and industrial expertise, and then going a step further in our special steels division and making steel components for the industry, right? So I think we're quite, say, well versed in getting these steps of getting technology, innovation, and industrial expertise to get, say, an ingredient to the market as a value-added product, right? So I think so that had a good affinity to us. Okay, if this is really what's needed to make this become a reality, to make this product really go to the market, it's a good fit of Gerdau, right? And also, even though we are agnostic to where we're applying these investments, right? We're not really necessarily applying things that are really connected to steel. The end applications we see have also an interesting connection to what we're actually servicing today in the market, right? So we have a very strong positioning in construction and the automotive sector. Many of the applications that are readily available for graphene, if the right investment is done, are in these two sectors, right? So there's a good synergy there for Gerdau, right? I think so that really has also a good affinity to saying why we're looking at this material rather than other materials, for example, that could be in the life sciences or in other markets that are a bit farther away from where we're currently servicing today, right?
So a question I do have for you, if you look at the global trends in commerce and industry today, there are a lot of companies that have made significant net zero objectives and claims for their companies. And now we're at the point where they actually need to do something about it. Okay. And we see that as a major impetus for using a material like graphene to reduce energy inputs, make products longer lasting, improve recyclability. What is your perspective on the role graphene might play for companies that are trying to hit net zero targets?
I think graphene is critical in that sense because, I mean, the essence of graphene really what graphene will do when you apply it into a product is really giving it more efficiency, be it through the use of less materials overall, right? Because of some performance gain, be it because of a longer lasting end material and product that will probably require less maintenance or less change, right? So I think, or either through some process efficiency, right? So less energy use, less material use, right? So basically, usually the main topics on graphene applications, how do you give efficiency to an end product, right? So to give a few examples, you can make concrete with less cement, right? You can make concrete that will have a higher resistance, last longer. You can make paints that will have a much higher resistance, right? And they will coat a material that will, because of that, require less of a maintenance cost, less investment. You can have lubricant boosters that will make your motors use less fuel and have less maintenance costs again. So these are all the topics around graphene. So to me, the key drive in graphene is how does it bring efficiency? How does it make something more sustainable, right? So it is a key ingredient to do that. On the other hand, since it's a nano material, the less you use it, the better. We talk about uses of graphene around 0.4, 0.2, less than 1% in most cases, right? So it's not something that has to go in quantity to give the efficiency, right? So I think there is, a hot topic around it. If it's correctly used, it can really help all these industries to find the net zero they're looking for, right? And I think also once it starts picking up speed, also, as you mentioned, there's several different ways to produce graphene, and some of them even are about using sources like forests, which can be actually planted. So they're, let's say, a renewable recycled source, or from recycling of plastics or the materials are heavy in carbon. So I think as the industry evolves, also we'll find even some interesting renewable sources of graphene to add to that mix, right? So for sure, to me, it's a key element in helping companies find net zero, and that's, I think, one of the key reasons I think it's going to pick up pretty quickly once you start seeing commercial solutions with graphene inside.
I think it's a pretty elegant solution, using carbon to solve the carbon problem, right?
That's true. That's very true.
And I think you hit on something else that's kind of magical, is that when people think of using graphene, if they're not that familiar with it, they think about adding quite significant amounts. And in fact, you're using much less than 1%, tenths or even hundredths of a percent by weight, and yet getting double-digit significant improvements in performance factors and strength. And so it really is, using less is more with graphene. So a little bit of it goes quite a long way to improve performance. Well, the Graphene Council is really proud to have Gerdau Graphene as a member in the Graphene Council. We really enjoy working with you. And I would also say, I think Gerdau Graphene is playing a very unique role in the graphene ecosystem, stimulating demand, working on that application development piece, working with multiple suppliers of graphene materials, and working with multiple end users. And I wanted to ask you, Alex, if you think of our audience as comprising graphene producers, but as well as companies who are thinking about how can graphene improve their products or make their companies more competitive or unlock some new applications, what words would you like to close with, to share with those people who are thinking about graphene, or maybe who have looked at it in the past and haven't looked at it recently?
The main, I think, say, what I would really try to challenge these people back is, I think the industry has changed, right? So as back to what we were speaking earlier, graphene is a much more mature point in terms of technology, right? I think they're also in terms of the will of the producers to have scale and have the right pricing. So I think even though there's a challenge there, several companies are doing good investments or ready to do more investments in bringing this to scale at the right price, right? So I think one of the challenges in the past was not finding the material at the right scale, at the right price. That's also has changed, right? So I think we're going to a new period of development for this industry, right? But again, we still have a big challenge in doing the development work the right way, more of an industrial mindset than a R&D mindset. So I think now, as you mentioned, we're trying to push this in this, we're trying to change that. So I think you like us, probably other companies will follow in doing this in the right way. And I think you also there's seeing more and more end customers looking at it's really easy to apply graphene if you have the right mindset. So I think, and there's partners out there like us who can help them do that. So I think it's a time to maybe revisit these old concerns of graphene, or it's also time to rekindle the interest in looking at it as a very good innovation anticipation for these products, right? And again, having a little bit of the patience to get this at the right point, we'll probably see a couple next 2-3 years, several products coming out with graphene at volume with the right value proposition behind and the right price.